The roar of the motorcycle engine echoed down the quiet, desolate street, a sound that didn't belong in this sleepy, racially divided town. As the black woman rider sped past the empty storefronts, her leather jacket glistening under the late afternoon sun, it felt like a challenge, a defiant statement that this town with its quiet prejudices and deep-rooted history, was about to be shaken up in a way no one could have predicted. In the distance, the town's residents began to notice. Some of them paused in their daily routines, working on cars, sweeping porches, chatting on the sidewalks, and their eyes followed her. Her motorcycle, a beast of chrome and power, wasn't the problem. It was her. A black woman riding through a town where such a sight was not just rare, it was unheard of. And even as she rode with the wind in her face, with an unyielding look of focus, she knew this town wasn't ready for her. But she was ready for them. Her name was Jasmine. Born and raised in the city, she had spent most of her life dreaming of this moment, the moment she would take her freedom, her identity, and her bike, and drive into the very heart of a place that never believed she belonged. A town that, in its small-mindedness, was stuck in a time long past. A town where people judged by the color of your skin before the content of your character, where the boundaries of race seemed as immovable as the mountains in the distance. Jasmine's heart raced as she shifted gears, her powerful bike surging forward with a growl. She'd trained for this moment, prepared for the uncertainty, the judgment, and the stares. She knew the risks. She knew she was stepping into the unknown, but the desire for something more, for breaking free from the chains of society's limitations, pushed her forward. Every mile she rode was a mile away from the stereotypes people tried to force upon her. Every turn of the throttle was a defiance against the expectation that people like her, black women, weren't meant to be a part of a world that had long been dominated by others. The town she was entering had a history steeped in tension, where racism wasn't just a thing of the past, but a living, breathing monster that people had learned to live with in silence. It was the kind of town where outsiders were greeted with suspicion, where the unfamiliar was met with resistance, and where anyone who dared to challenge the status quo was quickly reminded of their place. People didn't speak about it openly, but it was there, beneath the surface, an invisible barrier that shaped the town's culture and its people's behavior. A divide that had existed for generations. And then there was Jasmine. A black woman, strong, independent, and unafraid to embrace her passions. She wasn't just any rider. She was a woman of purpose, a woman on a mission. Her story wasn't just about riding motorcycles. It was about redefining what it meant to be seen, to be heard, to break the chains of the stereotypes that tried to box her in. As she approached the edge of town, her mind raced with the weight of what she was about to face. The challenge wasn't just about proving herself on her bike, but about confronting the deep-rooted beliefs that this town held. This wasn't just a ride for Jasmine. It was a fight for her identity, her freedom, and for the right to be more than what people had labeled her. The streets narrowed as she approached the center of town, and the tension in the air thickened. A few locals had already gathered outside the diner on the corner. They were the kind of people who had spent their entire lives in this town, their perspectives shaped by years of small-town thinking. And as they looked up at Jasmine, they saw a challenge, a test of their own beliefs, their own perceptions. She could feel their eyes on her, the unspoken judgments settling into the space around her. The whispers started. The looks turned from curiosity to something darker, something that didn't belong. The kind of looks that said, "What is she doing here?" Or, "She doesn't belong in this world." Jasmine's grip tightened on the handlebars as she rolled past the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of the people watching her. She had come here to confront the hate, the judgment, and the fear that people like her had faced for so long. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let them dictate her story. But deep inside, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, would they ever accept her? Could she ever truly belong in a place like this, where every step she took felt like a declaration of war against the boundaries they had drawn? The motorcycle's engine hummed beneath her, a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. With every turn of the wheels, the world around her seemed to grow smaller. The town was changing, slowly, imperceptibly, but Jasmine could feel it. Something was stirring. Something was ready to break free. The man who had confronted Jasmine continued to stand with his arms crossed, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed to challenge every inch of her resolve. His name was Earl, and though he wasn't the mayor or any kind of official, his presence in the town carried a weight that few dared to challenge. He was known for his work at the mechanic shop, and for many, he was the unofficial voice of authority. His family had lived in this town for generations, and like many others, they had long believed in the strict order of things, an order where certain people, certain types, just didn't belong. Jasmine's heart raced as she stood facing him, the crowd's whispers slowly dying down. The tension between them hung thick in the air, like the calm before a storm. She could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear the quiet judgment coming from the onlookers. It was as if they were waiting for her to blink, waiting for her to show some sign of weakness. But Jasmine was no stranger to challenges. Growing up in a city where she was often told she couldn't, she had learned to defy expectations. She had learned that sometimes you had to fight to exist. And now, standing in the middle of this town, she wasn't going to back down. Earl finally spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "You think you can just ride into this town like you own the place, like you're not gonna stir things up." His words were thick with disdain, each one heavier than the last. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jasmine replied, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here to live my life, just like anyone else." Earl let out a short laugh, the sound grating against the silence that had fallen over the crowd. "That's the problem," he said. "People like you think you can just show up and expect everything to be fine. You don't get to waltz in here and pretend like the world's changed." Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she didn't let his words rattle her. Instead, she took a step forward, her presence unwavering. "The world is changing, whether you like it or not," she said. "And I'm not going anywhere." The crowd was silent now, watching with bated breath as the standoff continued. Jasmine could feel the weight of their expectations, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. It wasn't just Earl she had to face. It was the entire town's collective history of prejudice, their deep-rooted fears of the unfamiliar. She was standing in the middle of their world, refusing to shrink away. As she looked around, she saw a few familiar faces in the crowd, people who had watched her grow up in the city, people who understood the quiet fight that came with simply existing in spaces where you weren't welcomed. Her mind drifted to those memories, the whispers, the sideways glances, the way her presence always seemed to make people uncomfortable. But there was a strength in that discomfort, a power in forcing people to confront their biases, to question the things they took for granted. Earl sneered, taking a step toward her, and the crowd seemed to lean in, anticipating the explosion that might follow. But before he could say another word, a voice cut through the tension. "Earl, leave her be." It was a woman's voice, calm but firm, cutting through the animosity like a knife. Jasmine turned to see an older woman standing on the steps of the diner, her arms crossed in a gesture that mirrored Earl's. Her name was Margaret, and though she wasn't as prominent in town as Earl, she had a quiet influence of her own. Margaret wasn't known for being outspoken, but when she spoke, people listened. Earl shot her a look, his face contorted in frustration. "She doesn't belong here, Margaret, and neither do you." "Sometimes," Margaret retorted, her voice sharp. "This town doesn't own anyone, least of all her." And if you think it does, then maybe you need to take a good long look at yourself. The silence that followed was thick, the kind of silence that only comes when something profound is said. For a moment, it felt as if the entire town held its breath, unsure of what would happen next. Earl's eyes flickered with uncertainty, his posture stiffening, but Margaret stood her ground, unwavering. Jasmine could feel a shift in the atmosphere, like a door that had been cracked open just a little bit. She hadn't expected Margaret to speak up for her, not in a place like this. But somehow, her words had made a difference. The people in the crowd began to murmur among themselves, their voices a mix of confusion, curiosity, and, for some, reluctant understanding. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that this was the turning point. She wasn't just fighting Earl anymore. She was fighting for the very fabric of the town itself, for the possibility that it could be different, that it could evolve beyond the boundaries it had set. But Earl wasn't finished. He stepped back, his shoulders stiff, and raised his chin in a defiant gesture. "You'll regret this," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This town doesn't change for people like her. It never will." And with that, he turned and stalked off, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement as he disappeared into the distance. For a long moment, no one moved. The crowd stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. Jasmine didn't know if she should feel victorious or uneasy. It had been a small victory, sure, but it was just the beginning. Margaret stepped down from the stairs and approached her, her eyes softening. "You're brave, girl," she said, her voice quieter now. "You're doing something no one thought possible." Jasmine managed a small smile. "I'm just getting started." The crowd around her slowly began to disperse, some people casting quick glances her way, others retreating into their daily lives. But in that moment, Jasmine realized that she had begun to change the town, one person at a time. Her presence, her refusal to back down, had already started to chip away at the walls people had built around themselves. As she mounted her bike once more, she knew the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since arriving, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Things could change. Maybe not overnight, but change was coming. And she was going to be there to see it happen. She revved the engine, the familiar roar of the motorcycle filling the air once again. As she rode out of town, she didn't look back. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear: she wasn't leaving anytime soon. As Jasmine rode out of town, the engine of her bike roaring beneath her, the sense of uncertainty she had carried with her for so long began to fade. The wind, once a reminder of the fear and resistance that lay ahead, now felt like a symbol of her newfound strength. She had stood up to the town's prejudices, and though the battle wasn't over, something inside her had shifted. She knew she wasn't just fighting for her place here anymore. She was fighting for a future where people like her didn't have to fight at all. But as she sped down the empty highway, a thought gnawed at her. It was only a small voice, one she had been trying to ignore, but it was there nonetheless. What if the change she had started wasn't enough? What if the town could never see past its own biases? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. But deep down, she knew it was possible. No, likely, but not everyone was going to accept her, no matter how much she fought. Jasmine took a deep breath and steered her bike toward the outskirts of town, where the roads grew quieter. She had expected the silence of the open road to comfort her, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, something else settled in, a quiet but undeniable sense of dread. Had she truly changed anything? Or was she just pushing against a wall that had been there for centuries? Just as doubt threatened to take over, her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled over to the side of the road, heart pounding as she checked the message. It was from Margaret. "Meet me at the diner tomorrow morning. "It's time." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. It's time. What did that mean? Was there more to Margaret's words than just a simple invitation? Her mind raced with possibilities, and the tension she had felt earlier seemed to return with full force. Could there be a shift happening in the town that she hadn't seen coming? Could the tide of change be turning in her favor? The next morning, Jasmine arrived at the diner as the first light of day broke across the sky. The town was still asleep, wrapped in the quiet, mundane rhythm of early morning. As she parked her bike outside and stepped inside, the bell above the door rang with an unfamiliar, almost hopeful tone. Margaret was already sitting at a booth in the back, sipping a cup of coffee, her eyes focused on the window as she waited. She looked up as Jasmine approached, her face softening with a quiet smile. "Morning, girl," Margaret said, her voice steady but warm. "I'm glad you came." Jasmine slid into the booth across from her. "What's this all about, Margaret? What do you mean by it's time?" Margaret set her coffee cup down and leaned forward, her eyes intense. "It's time for this town to wake up, Jasmine. You've made more of an impact than you realize. You forced us to see the truth we've been hiding from for far too long. I'm not saying it's going to be easy or that everyone will be on board, but the first step has been taken." Jasmine felt a flutter of hope in her chest, but it was quickly followed by skepticism. How? What can a few people in this town really do? Margaret's smile deepened. "You'd be surprised. A few months ago, there were folks who wouldn't even look at you when you passed through. But last night, we held a town meeting. People spoke up. Some for you, some against you, but they spoke. And that's the first step. They can't ignore the problem anymore. Not after what you did." Jasmine's eyes widened. "You did what?" "I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure you were ready," Margaret admitted. "But it's time you knew. I've been working with a few others, people who believe in change. We've been talking to the mayor, to some of the influential folks here. Slowly but surely the walls are coming down." Jasmine sat back, a mix of disbelief and gratitude filling her. "You mean this could really happen?" "Real change." Margaret nodded. "Real change doesn't happen overnight, girl. It's not going to be easy. But your courage has given people here the strength to speak their truth, to look at things with fresh eyes." Just then, the door of the diner opened, and to Jasmine's surprise, several townsfolk walked in. It was still early, and most of the town wasn't yet up. But these were people who had been part of the meeting. People who had been divided for so long, but had now made the decision to stand together. A few of them nodded at Jasmine as they passed by, and for the first time, there wasn't any discomfort in their eyes. There wasn't the usual judgment, only something else. Respect. Earl wasn't among them, but Jasmine